Hello heroes, and welcome to another uncanny episode of History of the Marvel Universe. This channel is brought to you in part by Patreon supporters. If you would like to help decide what topics get covered on the channel by voting in monthly polls and get your name in the special thanks at the end of each episode, you can sign up for $1 per month over at patreon.com/MaryMarvelite. The link is in the description below, along with other places you can find me, like my Twitch page where I stream every weekend. For this week's video, we're talking about an important figure in the Marvel Universe, particularly when it comes to mutants, the founder of the X-Men, Professor Charles Francis Xavier. Now, between the sliding timeline and various retcons, this one is going to be a little messy, but let's go ahead and go through it and talk about the events of his life in roughly chronological order. Born in New York City, Charles was the son of a wealthy scientist named Brian Xavier and his wife Sharon. Charles actually had his first encounter with an alien entity before he was even born, an emotional energy parasite that the Shi'ar call a Mummudrai. While in utero, the Mummudrai copied his DNA, effectively becoming his twin sister. The two siblings fought in the womb, with the still fetal Charles Xavier instinctively resisting the alien, killing the physical body it attempted to create for itself and causing it to be stillborn. And so Charles was born into his wealthy family, never knowing about his supposedly dead twin sister. We won't really have time to touch on this more in this video, so we'll note now that the Mummudrai survived as a mass of cells, regrowing her physical form and eventually emerging as the villain Cassandra Nova. Their father, Brian, was a geneticist who worked at a research facility in Alamogordo, New Mexico. He and his associates worked under a man who called himself Nathan Milbury, but was secretly the twisted geneticist known as Mr. Sinister. As one of many insane schemes, Sinister plotted to use the children of the scientists as potential host bodies for his own consciousness in the event of his death. Brian Xavier's colleagues, Kurt Marko, Alexander Reiking, and Irene Adler, also worked with the Eugenics Information Center in Nevada, which was funded and overseen by Nathan Milbury. That facility was run by a woman named Amanda Muller, the Black Womb. I talked about her in my video about the origins of the X-Men Gambit, so you can check the link in the description for that one if you'd like more information. This is another storyline that we won't really have time to circle back around to, so if you want to see Mr. Sinister's attempts to take over Xavier's body later in his life, you can read X-Men Legacy number 208 to 214. But back to the story at hand. When Charles was only 7, his father was killed in a nuclear accident at Alamogordo. Brian's colleague Kurt Marko was there to console Sharon Xavier, but Charles never trusted him. Regardless, mere months later, Kurt convinced Sharon to marry him and became Charles's stepfather. He moved into the Xavier's ancestral mansion in Westchester, and even at that young age, Charles's telepathic abilities began to develop, allowing him to tell that his stepfather's motivations were less than pure. Kurt Marko soon began neglecting his family, focusing on his work, and it became clear that he was a man with a short temper. Not long after, his son from a previous marriage, Kane Marko, also moved into the Xavier mansion. And while this is a trope that unfortunately keeps coming up, Kurt was indeed physically abusive towards his son Kane. Kane in turn became cruel himself and bullied his new stepbrother Charles. Kurt's abuses would only get worse as he turned his hand on his own wife, and several years later, after turning to alcoholism, Sharon Xavier passed away as well. The whole troubled family situation came to a head when Kane accused his father of intentionally killing Brian Xavier. Overhearing this accusation, young Charles stormed in and demanded to know the truth. In the ensuing altercation, Kane knocked over his father's chemicals, accidentally causing an explosion that set fire to the lab. Despite being fatally injured in the blast, Kurt finally performed an unselfish act and pulled both children out of the blaze. He passed away shortly thereafter from smoke inhalation, but before dying he admitted that while he didn't intentionally cause Brian's death, he might have been able to rescue him if he'd tried instead of saving himself. He also warned Charles to beware what would happen if Kane were to find out about his power, implying that Kurt knew that Charles was a mutant, which of course makes sense given his connection to Mr. Sinister and Black Womb. Those retcons all kind of fit. Soon Xavier became fully aware of his powers himself and used his abilities to excel in his schooling. The power to read minds even helped him perform well in sports by predicting his opponent's moves. As a side effect of his abilities, he lost his hair as a teenager, but also graduated high school early and, according to different sources, potentially both graduated from Harvard and attended Bard College at 16. Within 2 years, he'd earned a bachelor's degree in biology and enrolled in Oxford under a scholarship. While there, he met a Scottish woman named Moira Kinross, and the two quickly grew close. Now, in more recent tales, it's been revealed that Moira is also a mutant with the power to reincarnate upon death, starting a new timeline that was initially identical to her previous one, but retaining the memories of her past lives. This opens up a whole can of worms related to the House of X and Powers of 10 storyline, which we're not going to delve into too much today. The nature of Moira's powers also rendered her X gene undetectable, and so she kept her mutant status secret, with Xavier being one of the few to know the truth. Because in modern continuity, Moira and Xavier apparently conspired to eventually bring about the mutant nation, and because they planned to choose partners that would maximize chances of having powerful mutant children, many of the following events could be called into question or recontextualized. With that caveat in mind, I'm going to mostly be discussing these stories as they were originally presented when Moira was believed to be a regular human. Just keep in mind that if you're reading more modern stories, that much of this can be taken with a grain of salt. For example, according to one source, Moira had a boyfriend when they first met, a Royal Marine named Joseph McTaggart. One weekend, when Moira asked Charles to join them on a weekend trip, Joe warned Xavier not to get between him and his girl. But soon it would be Joe's own mistakes that would separate them after he and Moira left Xavier at the pub. While riding his motorcycle, with Moira on it with him, in the wind and rain, Joseph took a turn too fast and hydroplaned into a stone wall. Telepathically sensing Moira's peril from the bar, Xavier rushed to their aid and rescued them both. Following that incident, Charles and Moira fell in love, and Moira broke up with Joe while he was still in the hospital. Xavier completed his studies, earning PhDs in genetics, biophysics, and psychology by the time he was 18. Apparently, during this time, he was approached by the mutants Wolverine and Sabretooth, who wanted him to join a team they were putting together, but in this instance he refused. That plot point comes from the 2012 miniseries The First X-Men, which fits questionably into continuity. Charles and Moira later planned to marry, as they had done in one of her previous lives. But first, Xavier wanted to prove Joe McTaggart's assessment of him as a useless intellectual wrong, and enlisted in the military. It should be noted that it was originally reported that Charles was drafted into the military just before they were set to marry, and Moira promised to wait for him. During his tour of duty, Xavier's telepathic abilities made him a legend in the field of search and rescue. During one mission in Korea, he was assigned to the same unit as his step-brother, Kurt Marko. However, while under enemy fire, Kane attempted to flee. Xavier ran after him in an attempt to retrieve him, but the two stumbled upon an ancient hidden temple built to worship the magical entity known as Sitarak. There, Marko claimed a mystical crimson gem that transformed him into an unstoppable juggernaut. Enemy fire soon caused the cave they were in to collapse, and while Charles escaped, Kurt Marko was buried under a mountain of rubble. Sometime after this, Xavier received a letter from Moira breaking off their engagement. In one story, it was said that in her letter she claims to have met someone like her and owed it to herself to give it a chance. The implication being another human like her, and since she later married Joseph McTaggart, this is one of those plot points that's been complicated by multiple retcons. It wasn't established until after this story was first published that Moira and Joe had a previous relationship, so one could assume that they actually got back together. Furthermore, their whole relationship has been recontextualized by the more recent revelations that implied that Moira and Charles both planned to choose partners that would allow them to parent powerful mutants. Because indeed, Kevin McTaggart, the child of Moira and Joe, eventually grew into a psionic energy being with reality warping powers known as Proteus. Anyway, with no real reason to return, Xavier re-upped for a second tour of duty after his first had completed. He apparently also went on missions alongside Carmen Pride, who would later father the mutant Kitty Pryde, and the Canadian soldier Logan, aka Wolverine. It should of course be noted that Wolverine's appearance in this flashback from 2005's Excalibur number 14 doesn't really gel with the events that are depicted in the first X-Men, but Logan's been inserted into so many backstories and flashbacks that trying to pin down exactly when he canonically first met anyone is often an exercise in futility. And of course, as I said, the first X-Men doesn't really fit that well into continuity anyway, but it does also depict Xavier learning about Boulevard Trask's mutant hunting sentinel robots, and the head of the FBI's mutant investigating division, Fred Duncan, which will both come up again later. One thing we can say definitively is that following his time in the army, Xavier decided to begin traveling the world. While visiting Cairo, Egypt, he was pickpocketed by a young Aurora Monroe, who would later grow up to be the X-Man Storm. Xavier chased after her, telepathically compelling her to stop, and realized that she too was a mutant. However, before he could introduce himself, he was psionically attacked by a malevolent entity. The young mutant slipped away, and Xavier searched for the source of the assault. A mutant named Amal Farouk, who had merged with an ethereal entity from the multiverse known as the Shadow King. The two engaged in a psychic battle on the astral plane that nobody around them was aware of. While the Shadow King kept his foe on the defensive, Xavier was able to focus his psionic power and use it to strike at Farouk's brain, killing him. It's been said that this was Xavier's first encounter with an evil mutant, and he realized the need to defend humanity against such foes. He also spent time in Israel working at a clinic tending to traumatized Holocaust victims. One such patient was a woman named Gabrielle Haller, who'd been rendered catatonic when the Nazis forcefully planted the location of a hidden gold cache in her mind. But thanks to Xavier's telepathic powers, he was able to help her regain consciousness. It was also during this time that he met a man calling himself Magnus, a volunteer worker at the hospital and Holocaust survivor. The two soon became close friends and had many lengthy debates about mankind's ability to accept the emerging mutant race. Meanwhile, Charles Xavier and Gabrielle Haller also grew close and fell in love. However, the hospital was soon attacked by the terrorist group Hydra, led by the Nazi war criminal Baron Wolfgang von Strucker. The Hydra troops captured Haller and extracted the information implanted in her mind. With it, Baron Strucker unearthed the hidden Nazi gold and planned on using it to further his goals. However, Magnus and Xavier revealed their mutant powers to one another and rescued Gabrielle. They also battled Strucker himself, who was armed with a strength-enhancing gauntlet known as a Satan Claw. Magnus defeated Strucker, crushing the claw with his magnetic powers, and left with the reclaimed gold. Xavier later moved on to continue his travels as well, purportedly unaware that Gabrielle was pregnant with his child. However, much like Moira had a powerful mutant child with Joe McTaggart, Xavier's son, David Haller, grew up to become a mutant with seemingly limitless potential known as Legion. You see, as an adult, David possessed multiple personalities, with each one controlling a different superhuman ability. Furthermore, whenever a new personality manifested, a new power was gained along with it. And okay, a bit of a side note here, Legion later traveled to the past, specifically the point in time in which Xavier and Magnus were both still in Israel. Legion's plan was to kill Magnus before he became the villain Magneto, believing that it was their conflict that prevented Xavier from being a real father to him. But Xavier intervened, resulting in Legion accidentally killing his own father before he was conceived. This altered the timeline drastically, resulting in the Age of Apocalypse. However, things were changed back when Bishop, an X-Man from another possible timeline even further in the future, stopped Legion from killing anyone. The proper Earth 616 timeline was restored, and the altered Age of Apocalypse timeline persisted as a separate reality designated Earth 295. As the timeline rebuilt itself, Charles, Magnus, and Gabby lost their memories of their encounters with the time travelers, and things proceeded normally from there. Speaking of lost memories, at another point during his worldly travels, Xavier came upon two members of the group Clandestine, Gracie Gamble and Cuckoo, psychically battling an interdimensional entity called Sinwraith. Xavier aided them, adding his strength to theirs, but after the invading demon was repelled, the two women suppressed Xavier's memories of their encounter, which he would not recall for several decades. While the exact order of the aforementioned events can be disputed, the last location visited on his world tour was a remote Tibetan town near the Himalayas. It was there that Xavier first encountered a being known as Lucifer, who used advanced technology to subjugate the innocent townspeople. This Lucifer was not the fallen angel, however, but rather a member of the alien race, the Quist. Specifically a secretive imperialistic caste called the Arcane, who saw other races as inferior and covertly enslaved other planets. While Lucifer's alien machines dominated the minds of his subjects, Xavier was able to free a number of them from his control and started a rebellion against him. With his equipment damaged by Xavier, Lucifer was ordered to relocate to another site by his master, the Supreme One. But not before he caused a large stone slab to fall from the ceiling, crushing Xavier's legs and covering Lucifer's escape. Unable to move, Charles reached out telepathically, making contact with a mutant mercenary named Tessa, today better known as Sage, in the Hindu Kush Mountains. She recovered Xavier and brought him to a hospital in India, where he learned that he would never walk again. Despite this injury, his will to live was soon reignited by an American Red Cross nurse named Amelia Vaught. Amelia assisted in Xavier's physical therapy, encouraging and pushing him, and as the two grew closer, they eventually fell in love. Charles Xavier also began reflecting on everything he'd encountered during his travels. The Shadow King in Egypt, Magnus in Israel, Lucifer in Tibet. Xavier knew that the world would need heroic mutants who could stand up to these kinds of threats, both from alien menaces and members of his own species who sought to wage war on humanity. He also knew that many young mutants would need guidance and training, but first he would have to find them. And so he started designing a machine capable of locating mutants like himself, Cerebro. However, Amelia Vaught found these plans and angrily confronted him, revealing that she herself was a mutant with the power to transform into mist. She initially assumed that Xavier sought to hunt mutants for some nefarious purpose, but Charles then revealed his own mutant power to her, deepening their bond. Amelia traveled with Charles when he returned to the United States, moving into his Westchester home. While planning his next move, Xavier apparently resumed graduate work at Columbia University in New York, earned a PhD in anthropology, and spent several more years in London, where he gained his fifth PhD, this time in psychiatry. During this return trip to Europe, he reconnected with Moira Kinross, now Moira McTaggart, who by this point had become a geneticist of considerable renown, and was estranged from her husband Joe. The two renewed their friendship, but not their romance, and Charles shared with Moira his plans while the two discussed founding a school. According to some reports, after returning to America again, Xavier briefly worked with Dr. Karl Lycos, who later became the energy-draining were-pterodactyl Sauron. That's not particularly relevant to this story. I just like pointing out that there is in fact a vampiric energy-draining were-pterodactyl named Sauron. Anyway, back in America, Charles was contacted by a professor from Bard College, John Gray, to help his traumatized daughter, Jean. When her best friend Annie had been fatally struck by a car, Jean's mutant powers emerged prematurely, causing her to telepathically experience the sensation of dying. Xavier helped her recover, pulling her out of the mental cycle that she had trapped herself in, and tutoring her in the use of her abilities. He helped her hone her telekinetic powers, allowing her to move objects with her mind, but when it became clear that she was too young to properly control her mind-reading abilities, Xavier erected a mental barrier protecting her mind from the thoughts of others until she was more mature. At one point, Xavier also apparently tried to recruit the superpowered Romani twins, Wanda and Pietro Maximoff, but they refused. Meanwhile, Moira had built her own mutant research facility on Muir Island off the coast of Scotland, and Xavier continued working with her. Charles and Amelia later met with Magnus, now calling himself Magneto, at the site of the Auschwitz concentration camp. Xavier tried one final time to dissuade Magneto from enacting his war on humanity, but to no success. Furthermore, by this point, Magneto had recruited Wanda and Pietro after they became indebted to him for saving them from an angry mob. At the same time, public knowledge of mutants was becoming more common, and the FBI began investigating their increased numbers. Using his mental powers to get past security, Xavier met with Fred Duncan, the agent in charge of the FBI's Special Mutant Division. Xavier explained his plan to bring together a team of mutants for the benefit of mankind, and that if his people were hunted and persecuted, they could be forced into becoming the very menaces that Duncan wanted to prevent. And so Fred Duncan formed an alliance with Charles Xavier, passing along information on potential mutants in exchange for regular reports. This soon led to Xavier finding his first real recruit, a teenage orphan named Scott Summers. Unable to control his powerful eye beams, Scott had run away and met the mutant criminal Jack Winters. Jack had low-level telepathy and teleportation powers, but also learned that when exposed to a certain isotope, his body would be transformed into living diamond, as had already happened with his hands. Xavier used a machine called Cyberno, a rudimentary version of his planned Cerebro, to find the two mutants. While Jack succeeded in transforming himself into a living diamond, Xavier mentally guided Scott in the use of his powers to combat him. The battle ultimately ended when Xavier had Scott use a vibration cannon to hold Winters in place, only for the living diamond to destroy himself when his efforts to break free caused his body to shatter. Scott was then brought back to Xavier's mansion in Westchester, where he became the first X-Man, Cyclops. However, it seems that this is what finally drove a wedge between Charles Xavier and Amelia Vaught. She had been against the idea of the X-Men from the beginning, and the two had butted heads over it for months. While Charles insisted that such a team was necessary, Amelia feared that it would only escalate his inevitable conflict with Magneto, resulting in a genetics arms race. She was on her way out the door when Xavier used his telepathic power to stop her. He realized within seconds how horrible this was and released her, but Amelia felt so betrayed that she struck him before leaving forever. Ironically, she later joined Magneto, becoming one of his acolytes after losing her family to bigoted humans. Anyway, Xavier dispatched Cyclops to recruit his first teammate, a boy with freezing powers named Bobby Drake. While initially reluctant to join, Bobby agreed to go with Scott after he and Xavier saved him from a lynch mob. And so Bobby Drake became the second X-Man and took the code name Iceman. He in turn helped recruit the winged mutant Warren Worthington III, who was already operating as a costumed vigilante called the Avenging Angel. Those three then saved Hank McCoy, otherwise known as the Beast, from a villain calling himself the Conquistador. Finally, the last member of the original 5 X-Men was actually Xavier's first student, Jean Grey, who he'd been tutoring in secret but was now ready to complete the group as Marvel Girl. And of course, Charles Xavier would mentally guide and command them under the appropriate alias of Professor X. The X-Men were rigorously trained, the majority occurring in a special facility called the Danger Room, which mechanically simulated threats and obstacles they had to navigate, combat, or avoid. The team soon made their public debut when Magneto launched an attack on the military base on Cape Citadel, and the X-Men were dispatched to repel him. The X-Men, meanwhile, were not the only mutants that Xavier worked with, and he also recruited Tessa, aka Sage, to spy on the mutant Sebastian Shaw. He, of course, would later become an enemy as the Black King of the Hellfire Club, alongside his White Queen, Emma Frost, another mutant who Xavier and Moira failed to recruit. Some stories indicate that Xavier and Moira considered other various students like Piotr Rasputin, Kurt Wagner, and Aurora Monroe. While they were considered too young or simply not ready at that time, they would be brought in years later. Other mutants that Xavier and the X-Men encountered but could not recruit for one reason or another included the Vanisher, the Blob, Namor the Submariner, and Unus the Untouchable. In the early days of the X-Men, Xavier would often stay at the mansion and issue commands telepathically, but he helped in person when Magneto returned with his Brotherhood of Evil Mutants. The X-Men subsequently helped the Professor thwart another scheme from the alien Lucifer, and battled his step-brother Kurt Marko, who'd escaped from the mountain of rubble he was buried beneath after the Crimson Gem of Cyttorak transformed him into the unstoppable Juggernaut. After that, Xavier engaged in a live televised debate with the anthropologist Bolivar Trask regarding the so-called mutant menace. Trask's solution, of course, involved his mutant-hunting Sentinel robots, which would become a recurring threat to the X-Men and mutant kind in general, even after Trask's death. But perhaps that's a story for another week. Having witnessed his leadership potential, Professor X named Cyclops the field commander of the X-Men. He then set off to confront Lucifer a final time, and while he was captured, he was soon rescued by the X-Men, who defeated the alien once more, thwarting his invasion plans once and for all. And that pretty much covers the origin of Professor X and the founding of the X-Men. But if you'd like to know more about Lucifer, the Sentinels, or you just want to know more about Xavier's exploits after founding the X-Men, then let me know in the comments below. But that's all I've got time for this week, so if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, share the video, and subscribe for more marvelous content. As always, the issues referenced in this video are listed in the description below if you would like to read them for yourself, as well as links to other places you can find me, including my Patreon page where for only $1 a month you can get your name in these special thanks here, and my Twitch page where I stream every weekend. So until next time, true believers, Excelsior!